Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. Henry Ford. With this being one of the first partner commander decks that I will be talking about on the channel, I thought it a good idea to have a collaboration with another Magic the Gathering content creator, that being Time Walk with me. He creates commander deck overviews much to the same extent as I, and will be walking us through the strategies and downsides of the deck. With all that being said, the deck we will be talking about today is led by Eligeth Crossroads Augur and Kydele Chosen of Crewfix, and is something I like to call Scry with me.
To start, let's look at both Eligeth and Kydele. Eligeth reads, if you would scry a number of cards, draw that many cards instead. And Kydele reads, tap, add 1 colorless mana for each card you've drawn this turn. With these two, we can use the many scry cards in this deck, like Prognostic Sphinx, for card draw and ramp. From here, we need to determine what we want to draw into and use the mana for. The easiest and most reliable strategy comes in the form of big creatures. From cards like Thunderfoot Baloth to It That Betrays, we're looking to play a wide variety of big creatures that we can smash into our opponents. We can get these creatures pretty reliably, as scrying is a large component of the deck, letting us optimize our draws quite well even before we cast Eligeth. Kydele's mana ability can be quite powerful by running untap effects like Freed from the Real. If we can tap her more than once, she can generate an incredible amount of mana. With plenty of colorless mana, we just need to make sure we have enough colored mana, which shouldn't be a problem thanks to Green's color fixing resources. The result should be huge card advantage as we burn through the deck quickly. With all the large creatures that we could want, we do have some mana sinks in the deck that we can utilize when we need to. Though it's not the biggest selection, there is versatility within this section of cards like Nylea, God of the Hunt, pumping up our creatures, and Thassa, God of the Sea, giving our creatures unblockable. One of the biggest downsides to this deck is that we rely quite heavily on our commanders for our strategy to be fully effective. Without them, we're not nearly as explosive mana and card draw wise. We need to ensure that we can reliably protect them, or at least get the most we can out of them before they leave the battlefield. Cards like Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves are perfect for this. However, board wipes are going to be our worst enemy. If we ever try to commit to the board, we should hope to have some counterspells in hand to ensure that our pieces are protected. With us running 2 different commanders, we will have a large initial mana expense for the strategy to start taking effect. This starts with 10 mana should we want to try and get both out, but it's not the worst, as we can usually get Kydele out first and get Eligeth out the next turn, with Kydele ramping into him on our initial draw. Though we have a pretty good strategy overall, it takes time to set up. In most cases, though we may be able to get our big creatures out fairly quickly, we really want pieces that give abilities like Trample and Unblockable to really take over and win games. Without them, our opponents may be able to set up enough of a board presence to potentially mitigate the large amounts of damage that we're trying to throw at them.
To start with some of the most notable cards in the deck, let's look towards Thassa, God of the Sea, It That Betrays, and Psychosis Crawler. Thassa, God of the Sea gives us a mean of stable scry at our upkeep, which on its own is a fantastic ability that we will need, but it also offers an indestructible body and a means of giving our creatures unblockable. The unblockable function allows for all of our huge creatures to be unhindered by other large boards. Speaking of huge creatures, let's look at It That Betrays. For 12 colorless mana, we get a huge 11/11 with Annihilator 2. Annihilator 2, for those uncommon with Annihilator, is a triggered ability that reads, whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 2 permanents. This works particularly well with It That Betrays, as any permanent sacrificed will come under our control, slowly giving us more and more value each time we attack with it. Lastly, Psychosis Crawler gives us a great means of spreading out damage for the amount of cards that we're drawing. This may seem slow, as 1 or 2 cards may not make a big difference, but should we have Eligeth and a few scry cards in hand, we can easily deal 5 to 10 damage to our opponents. Psychosis Crawler also grows as our hand grows, so should we find him in combat with 7 or more cards in hand, he can become a real beater that opponents need to be wary of. For artifacts, we have a bit of a varied selection in the forms of Staff of Domination, Livecrafter's Bestiary, and Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots. Staff of Domination is one of the best mana sinks that we have in the deck, as we get a great range of different effects to choose from and potentially can activate multiple times. Also, a small piece of tech, but should we have both Staff of Domination and Kydele and have already drawn 5 cards in the turn, then we can generate infinite colorless mana. This alone can give a multitude of options that players would need to experiment with to determine what all could be done with such. Next up, let's talk about Lifecrafter's Bestiary. Bestiary gives us stable scry at our upkeeps, very similar to Thassa, but should we play a creature, we can also get a little card draw should we be willing to pay an extra green mana for each creature that we cast. Though these aren't the biggest effects, this advantage synergizes greatly with our commanders. Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves offer the same function that we're wanting, that being they offer haste and protection for our creatures and commanders. Though there is an argument that Lightning Greaves is much better than Swiftfoot Boots as the equip cost is 0, we need to be careful as there's going to be times that we want to target our creatures on other turns, and Shroud will not let us do so. For our enchantment selection, let's look towards Retreat to Coralhelm, Omniscience, and In Search of Greatness. Retreat to Coralhelm is a fantastic card in the deck for its flexibility and synergy with the commanders. For each lane we play, we get a selection of either Scry 1, turned Draw 1 with Eligeth, or tap or untap a creature. We could tap a few of our opponent's creatures, but what we should be thinking about doing is untapping Kydele, as her ability will give us mass mana acceleration. Omniscience is one of our game-threatening cards, as we are able to cast all the spells that we can imagine without having to pay their mana cost. This can do a lot for us, as the mana that we do have can sink into activated abilities that can be found on cards like Nylea and Staff of Domination. In Search of Greatness is a fantastic enchantment to utilize, as it could give us access to free permanents. Should we have a permanent with one higher CMC than the highest CMC of permanents that we have on board, then we may play that card without paying its mana cost, freeing up a lot of mana to use on other big spells that we want to cast. If we don't have a card in hand to meet these conditions, then we may scry 1 instead, all for just 2 mana. For sorceries, we have a bit of a nice selection to look at with Curse of the Swine, Mystic Speculation, and Elven Farsight. Curse of the Swine is, in essence, our pseudo board wipe. We may not be able to get all creatures, but we can target the ones that have some value. Also, an important factor to note is Curse exiles the creatures rather than destroying them, ensuring that threats will never come back. Mystic Speculation is a nice recursive Scry 3 effect should we be willing to pay in increments of 4 mana. Should we opt to play a little bit more explosive and have our commanders on the field, we can pay a total of 5 mana to draw 6 with Eligeth and tap for 6 with Kydele. Finally, Elven Farsight is potentially one of our best cantrips that we have in the deck, as it can potentially draw us 4 cards for 1 mana if we have Eligeth on the field. This will not always hit, but it is comparable to that, if not better than in those cases, to an Ancestral Recall. To talk about interaction, let's look at cards like Condescend, Crossing Grip, and Court of Calling. Condescend is an interesting counterspell, as it can either be held to counter something our opponents play, should we have the mana, or be a synergy piece for our commanders. For 1 mana, we will scry 2 no matter the mana spent into this card. Crossing Grip is one of our meanest forms of artifact and enchantment removal, as it holds split second. With this ability, our opponents cannot respond to this card, meaning that cards like Heroic Intervention or Counterspell can be added to the stack to try and stop this card. Court of Calling is one of our best creature tutors that we can have in the deck. With it, we can hold up large amounts of mana to dissuade opponents off of game-ending spells for fear of counterspells. However, in most cases, we'll be able to mitigate large amounts of damage as we can mana dump into the spell to find our best creatures and have them ready to attack on our next turn. For once, we're actually running Planeswalkers, and we have a few great ones with this strategy, those being Jace Mirror Mage and Nissa Steward of Elements. Jace Mirror Mage allows us the potential to scry 4 every turn with this +1 for 5 mana, should we be able to protect 2 different versions of Jace. Should we be able to do so, there may not be any other effect in the deck that can compare to the amount of recursive scry that this card can generate. With Eligeth and Kydele on the field, this scry explodes with value, drawing us 4 cards instead and generating 4 mana. We'll likely never use his 0 ability, as we already have a lot of card advantage to begin with, and we really don't want to lose either Jace. Nissa, Steward of Elements, gives us some flexible options to work with. Her +2 offers some scry, and her -6 gives us a few flying beaters through our lands. But the ability that has me most interested is her 0. With this ability, should we be able to initially mana dump into her to cast her, then we have the potential to cheat in some huge creatures, especially if we're scrying rather than drawing, as we'll be able to set up huge plays and expand our board presence. For lands, we have some great utility in the forms of Command Beacon, Rivendell, and Study Hall. Command Beacon is sort of our form of commander insurance. Should our commanders be receiving a lot of hate from our opponents and going back to the command zone over and over again, then we may sacrifice Command Beacon to instead bring one of our commanders to our hand rather than having to pay the continuously increasing commander tax. Rivendell is one of our best versions of a utility scry land. For 2 mana, we can scry 2, pairing great with our commanders. However, the only drawback to this ability is that we need a legendary to activate. This condition is quite easy for us to get around, as we do have 2 commanders that we can utilize to meet this requirement. Study Hall is another utility scry land that gets incrementally better as the game progresses. With it, should our commanders be receiving hate and we're forced to keep recasting them, we can opt to spend an extra mana to scry for how many times we have casted our commander this game. This pairs quite great for us as we do have 2 different commanders, and stacks quite quickly should the presence of board wipes and target removal be prevalent. The deck doesn't utilize any battles, as though there may be some that fit the mold, we're really trying to focus on our value and want our creatures to smash into our opponents rather than a battle. With us relying on our board presence so much, it would make sense to upgrade in a meaningful way. One card to potentially look towards would have to be Heroic Intervention. With this card, we'll be able to protect the large creatures that we have dedicated ourselves to, as well as our commanders by giving them all hexproof and indestructible. We may also look to make our big creatures even more explosive by adding cards like Apex Devastator, Wormcoil Engine, and World Spyworm. Should we think Curse of the Swine is a little overrated, we can simply run Cyclonic Rift in a slot to make sure no one gets non-land permanents other than us, and our big creatures can get in for some great damage. First, I want to thank Time Walk With Me. It was an incredible opportunity to do some work with someone in the community, and was a great learning experience. I really hope that we may be able to do more in the future, as I had a really great time working on this with you. Now, let's talk about the power level of this deck. In my opinion, I place this deck somewhere at either a 6 or a 7. This deck has incredible card advantage options in many different forms, and many ways of capitalizing on such advantage. Our strategy, though straightforward, has been shown time and time again to work, that being ramp into big creatures and swinging massive numbers into opponents. One of the key problems that the deck needs to find workarounds is just board and commander protection. The commanders play such a pivotal role in our strategy, and if one is lost, the other has a hard time trying to fill in the gaps. Either way, I would like to thank everyone for watching. I'm really happy to see what's happening with the channel and its steady growth. I remember releasing Mr. Pump a few months back, thinking nothing will ever come of it, but here we are with 20 subscribers and over 1,000 views. I really hope to keep on this track that we're going on, and if you're not subscribed, I would highly recommend it, as I'm sure the channel will have content for you if you like Magic in any capacity. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.